Two popes, three claims to legitimacy, and all of Europe arguing about it for 40 years. Again, what kind of institutional glitch could let the medieval church have two simultaneous mutually excommunicated leaders, each absolutely certain they were the real deal? This was the first time Europe's ancestral bickering machine ever completely blue-screened on a continental scale. You probably think electing a pope works like picking a president. A bunch of cardinals get locked in a room, they vote, enough votes are cast, the chimney puffs white smoke, and the whole world knows who the new boss is. That's the nice version. The reality is that this election isn't some quaint ancient ritual, it's a 2,000-year-old institutional machine that's been clanking along. Are stuffed with money, power, conspiracies, and layer upon layer of sacred camouflage. Today we're popping the hood on that machine, starting with the most grotesque medieval gridlock and following it all the way to how it shaped the deep logic of modern Western politics. First, let's clear up the biggest terminology trap. You call him Pope, but if you go back to the original canonical Latin, the more precise title is actually the Roman Pontiff, that is, the Bishop of Rome. Again, and above him sits the Holy See, which isn't a person but the entire central bureaucracy of the Curia, a chair plus the whole apparatus of officials who issue orders from it. This isn't nitpicking. If you don't grasp the distinction between the Pontiff, the Holy See, and the Bishop of Rome, you'll never understand medieval European power games. Kings weren't fighting over what to call him, they were fighting over who got to bet on that chair and how many legitimacy certificates that chair could churn out. 2i. So how did this electoral contraption grow out of chaos? In the beginning, the Bishop of Rome was simply the local leader of the Roman Church, much like any other bishop usually chosen by the clergy and laity of the city. But the see's wealth and land snowballed so fast that Rome's noble families smelled blood. Again, from the 9th to the 11th century, papal elections imploded into a private poker den for a handful of dynasties, murdering predecessors, bribing voters, outright mob violence, you name it. The craziest stunt was the Cadaver Synod of 897, when they dug up the previous pope, dressed him in vestments, and put him on trial. But that's a story for another time. The real institutional break came in 1059 when Pope Nicholas I issued a decree that ripped electoral power away from the Roman mob and the aristocracy and stuffed it into the hands of the College of Cardinals. His logic was simple: insulate the process from outside grubby hands and let the church insiders sort it out behind closed doors. Yeah, sounds reasonable, right? But as soon as you set up any institution, new loopholes breed inside it. So just how ugly could medieval papal elections get? The Great Schism of 1378 is the textbook case. By then, the French had had the papacy in their pocket for 70 years. The see had moved from Rome to Avignon, and 7 consecutive popes had been French. Finally, in 1378, Pope Gregory X first dragged the papacy back to Rome and then dropped dead the same day. Immediately, the Roman mob surrounded the conclave, swords rattling at the gates, screaming a Roman, or at least an Italian, or cut you all down. The cardinals, sweating under their robes, scrambled to elect an Italian, Urban V. You'd think that was the end of it. But Urban V, once he sat down, flipped the script and started yelling at the cardinals, calling them greedy traitors, and threatening to pack the college with Italians to dilute the French faction. The cardinals panicked, fled Rome a few months later, and issued a statement declaring that the earlier election had been held under duress, therefore invalid. Then they turned around and elected a French Pope, Clement V, one who cheerfully moved back to Avignon with his crew. So here you have it, the same College of Cardinals elected 2 popes, and both claimed to be the legitimate one. Dawn, Europe immediately took sides. France backed Avignon, England, and the Holy Roman Empire backed Rome. All of Christendom tore itself in half, each half waving excommunication decrees at the other like breach of contract notices. This wasn't a religious farce anymore, it was a total collapse of legitimacy. The electoral procedure was still there, but once that procedure had been hijacked by fear, interest, and national resentment, it could no longer squeeze out any consensus. Why did this machine stay broken for 40 years before it finally got patched up? Because when you have 2 popes staring each other down, the church found itself without any higher authority to slam the brakes. In theory, the pope is the top dog, but with 2 top dogs who don't recognize each other, who do you call for arbitration? European kings tried to intervene, but their meddling only cemented the split. Backing your side's pope meant holding a political chip, and nobody wanted to fold. Eventually, a bunch of theologians and canon lawyers cooked up a dangerous but effective concept, conciliarism, the idea that in extreme emergencies, a general council's authority could override even the pope. The Council of Constance was strong-armed into existence, not by any pope, but by the Holy Roman Emperor. And the council did something ruthless. Tied and deposed. Both popes forced out a third one that had popped up in the meantime, and finally elected Martin V, a compromise candidate everyone could barely stomach, to stitch the church back together. It took nearly 40 years, not because nobody wanted a solution, but because every possible path to one stepped on somebody else's vested interest. The machine was fixed, not by divine revelation, but by a bare-knuckle power realignment. That history still haunts the back of Western politics today. When you see political parties holding closed-door leadership votes or corporate boards battling over committee seats, you're looking at faint echoes of papal elections. At a deeper level, the whole schism exposed a core institutional question. Legitimacy is never automatic. It depends on a set of rituals, a set of procedures, and most crucially, on enough people being willing to accept the outcome. Why did the Middle Ages never stop bickering? Because that acceptance mechanism was too fragile. Once a crack opened inside, outside forces rushed in and levered it wider. Isn't that exactly what many international organizations are facing right now? On stage, procedural justice. Backstage, raw power play. Europe's ancestral bickering machine never counted on saints to run it. It could only stumble toward a temporary balance through one collapse after another, and the patching that followed. Next time you see white smoke rising from a papal conclave, don't just think ancient and mystical. That thin plume is rooted in 1,000 years of hard-won grimy lessons. Institutions outlast faces. The ugliness of papal elections wasn't because one man was particularly evil, it was because any unchecked absolute power will eventually show its true nature under the glaring light of human self-interest. The only way to make that machine bicker a little less is to forge rules harder than any person, even if that lesson was earned, with nearly 4 decades of schism and a handful of papal tiaras rolling on the floor. If you like this kind of sacred narrative, secular machinery deep dive, if you want to know how indulgences were turned into a money-shaving tool or what kind of business chain actually ran along the pilgrimage routes, make sure to follow this channel. Next time we keep dismantling